I'm going to tell you my favorite golf joke. Ted's probably heard this before. Anybody who's played golf with me probably heard this before. Jesus and Moses are out playing golf, and they come to this par 3 that's about 180 yards, and there's water in front of the green. And Moses says to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, what would Tiger Woods use on this hole?" And Jesus says, licks his finger, feels the wind, says, I think Tiger would use a 6-iron on this hole. So Moses goes over, pulls out his 6-iron, gets up to the ball, swings, nice shot, looks like he's going straight, lands short, right in the water. Moses, man, he's angry. He walks down to the water, raises his hand, commands the water to part, walks down, grabs the ball, comes back up to the tee box and says, "Jesus, listen, you know everything. You created Tiger Woods. You know the wind conditions today. You know the slope of the green. You know everything. What iron would Tiger hit?" And Jesus says, "Moses, I'm disappointed in you. I thought you were a man of faith. Listen, I do know everything, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that Tiger would use a 6-iron on this hole." So Moses goes back over, gets his 6-iron, pulls it out, gets up there, swings. Another nice shot, straight, but lands short right in the water. Well, Moses is even more angry, and he walks down and raises his hand to command that water to part. And just then, the next group behind is caught up to him, and they're looking down there, and they're saying, "Who does that guy think he is, Moses?" And Jesus says, "No, he thinks he's Tiger Woods." My brother and I had a chance years ago to actually go to a U.S. Open at Southern Hills Golf Course in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was back when Tiger was in his prime, and we were going from hole to hole. And there's always thousands of people out at those major golf tournaments, and so there are people everywhere. But the golf course is a big place, and so you can fit a lot of people out there. But I'm telling you what, there's one hole, every hole where it was packed out. Guess who was playing on that hole? Tiger Woods, man. We went once and got there when he was at a par 3. It didn't have water in front, so he wasn't playing with Moses or Jesus. But, we must have been from here halfway down the aisle to being able to see him. There are at least 12, 15 layers of people. And we're both tall, so we're able to stand up and kind of see him. And then we walked to the green to see, and we couldn't even see him putt, so we just left. We said we're going to go watch some other people play. But when I read this story about Zacchaeus, it always reminds me of that. And not that Jesus played golf, but that crowds of people would go see Jesus. After 3 years of ministry, amazing ministry, Jesus had become a celebrity. Almost everywhere he went, by this time, the crowds would gather around him to listen to him teach or to hear him argue with the religious leaders and the Pharisees. Most people probably gathered around him hoping to see a miracle occur. He'd heal people of their diseases. He'd cast out demons, and I'm sure people gathered around to listen or to see that. And I think sometimes of what stories were told about Jesus in these crowds. Somebody might be waiting to see Jesus do something, and there might be a man standing there who says, "Man, I was there a few months back, the Sea of Galilee. There were over 5,000 of us, because there are at least 5,000 men there. And Jesus was teaching, and man, we were all spellbound. We were listening to Jesus and just couldn't believe it. And we listened for hours, and before we knew it was evening. And we didn't have any food. None of us thought about bringing food. Can you believe that? And so we began to grumble to ourselves, man, what are we going to do now? And I look up and I see this young boy taking his basket of food up to Jesus and giving it to Jesus. And I think to myself, isn't that nice? That's really a good kid. He sees that Jesus has been teaching all day and Jesus is hungry, so he takes his food to Jesus. What a good boy. But that didn't help me. I was still hungry. But then I saw Jesus lift that food up and ask for God's blessings upon it. And then he brought it down, and his disciples were gathered around him. And all of a sudden, his disciples turn, and they have baskets full of food. And they bring that food to us and they place it down before us. And all of us, we eat. And not only that, when we're finished, he gathered up baskets of food afterwards. It was truly amazing. And somebody else in that crowd might have told the story of being in that house that time where Jesus was teaching, and it was a fairly small house, and so everybody was crowded in, and there were so many people that they were standing outside the door, and people couldn't get in the door because we were packed out inside, and every window, people were looking in the windows trying to listen to Jesus teach. And all of a sudden, we thought the roof was coming down on our heads. and we look up, and these four men are digging the roof away, and they lower their friend down, and their friend is paralyzed. He can't walk. Jesus looks up at these four men, and he looks down at this paralyzed man, and he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven. Rise and walk." And he does. That man who'd been paralyzed, he stands up and he rolls up his mat, and we all move back and we let him leave. It was truly amazing. And there might have been another man in the crowd that day who might have said, "Hey, don't run from me when I tell you this, but just last week I had leprosy. Just last week I had leprosy. And there were 10 of us. And we stayed together because nobody else wanted us around. And we were standing on a road, and we see Jesus coming towards us. And most people, when they came towards us, they moved away as far as they could because they didn't want to be close to us. But Jesus came right up to us, and he looked at us, and he said, 'Go show yourself to the priests.'" That's all he said. Go show yourself to the priests. We knew what that meant, because when you're healed, you're supposed to show yourself to the priest. But we still had leprosy. We were still covered with it. But we thought to ourselves, it's Jesus. It's Jesus. Let's do what Jesus says. And so we began to make our way to the local synagogue, which is where the priests would have been. And before we even get there, we're healed. It was truly amazing. And those are the stories that are being told about Jesus. And those are the stories that these people in Jericho are hearing about Jesus. And then they hear that Jesus is coming to their town. And they think, we've got to go see Jesus. And it's interesting, if you look back in the previous chapter, Luke 18, at the end of Luke 18, he talks about Jesus healing somebody even before he gets to Jericho. So I'm sure there were people who had been following Jesus and saw the healing, and they ran ahead and told everybody, Jesus is coming, and he just healed somebody. And so the crowds flock out to hear Jesus. When important people come to town, who goes out to see them? Now, possibly we've had some important people come to town recently, right? Who's been coming to town recently? Our presidential candidates. Had some this last week, someone today, a couple coming up this next week. And lots of people go out to see them. I mean, there are people of the political persuasion that they are go out to see them. There are city officials that go out to see them. There are news reporters that go out to see them. There are general people that go out to see them. And that's similar to the way it was in the time of Jesus. Whenever a celebrity came to town, man, people went to see him. And often we think of these crowds as, they're just the regular citizens go out to see him. But it wasn't that way in that time. In that time as well, just like today, when somebody important came to town, important people went out to see him. Went out to greet them and meet them. City officials. Zacchaeus was a city official. It says he was the chief tax collector. Who's our chief tax collector in Virginia Beach? Yeah. That's Zacchaeus in Jericho. You know, I write a check once a quarter to John. You know, here's my taxes. But that's who Zacchaeus was. And so important people went out to see Jesus because Jesus was a celebrity. Jesus was important. Now, here's something that's a little bit different in that culture than today. Today, usually when celebrities come, man, all of their details are planned. Their schedule's planned, who they're going to be with, what they're going to do, where they're going to eat, things like that are planned. In Jesus' days, they really didn't go ahead and plan those things. What happened was when the celebrity, and if you were a Roman leader of that day, if you came into a town, usually all the Roman leaders from that town would come out, and then you would choose who you wanted to go have a meal with, or maybe go spend the night with. And so people would come out, and boy, they'd be wearing all of their regalia, they'd be wearing their best attire, because they would want you to choose them. And so when Jesus came to town, man, we know the religious leaders were out there. They wanted Jesus to choose them. As a matter of fact, they probably had their long robes on, and they were looking good. And we know that Jesus, in other stories, he chose to go eat with Pharisees. And so I'm sure there were some Pharisees who thought, man, Jesus is going to choose us. I'm guessing some other other city leaders, Zacchaeus was out there. I'm guessing some other city leaders were out there as well, because it was common for them to go out there. And they were probably thinking, man, wouldn't it be great if Jesus chose us? But what does Jesus do? He looks up at the little man in the tree, and he says, Zacchaeus, I choose you. I want to come to your house today to have a meal with you. Wow. We don't catch it. That was big. That was important. And that's why this story tells us that all the religious leaders were grumbling. Can you believe he chose to go eat with a sinner? Because they were expecting Jesus to choose them. I want to go eat at your house. You're a priest. You're a leading figure. I want to come to you. And so Jesus chooses Zacchaeus, and they begin to grumble. I mentioned last week, I preached about a tax collector last week, and I mentioned that they were not well liked by the Jews. And Zacchaeus wasn't just any tax collector. He was the chief tax collector. Again, he was like our city treasurer. And the Bible says he was wealthy. The Jews didn't like him, but the Romans liked him because he collected taxes for them. And there were Romans who lived in Jericho. There were military people in Jericho, and they liked Zacchaeus. And I'm guessing that Zacchaeus lived in one of the best parts of the town, and Zacchaeus probably had a big house because he was a wealthy man. And he wasn't liked by the Jews, but man, he was liked by the Romans. Why did Zacchaeus climb that tree? Luke tells us that it's because he was short. But there were probably other short people in the crowd that day. And short people try to, fight their way through the crowd to get a front row seat, So why was Zacchaeus the one that had to climb the tree? Well, I think it's probably because the Jews didn't like him a whole lot. And there were a lot of Jews in that crowd that day. And what happens when you start trying to fight your way through a crowd? People are going to stop you, and they're going to get in front of you. And I'm guessing Zacchaeus got his shins kicked a few times. And I'm guessing Zacchaeus got a few elbows a few times. And Zacchaeus thought to himself, there's an easier way. I'm going to go climb that tree to see Jesus. But it wasn't socially accepted for men to climb trees. How many of you like to still climb trees? I like to still climb trees. I'll climb trees. But in that day, it wasn't socially accepted for men to climb trees. And ladies, how many of you ladies would climb a tree with a dress on? Hey, guess what? Men wore dresses back then, okay? They didn't call them dresses, but they wore robes or tunics. And in the Old Testament, there's a clear admonition not to expose yourself. And so, for Zacchaeus to climb this tree was a big deal. He really wanted to see Jesus. Zacchaeus is often made out to be a bad guy in this story who becomes a good guy. And it kind of is what happens. But do you know what the name Zacchaeus literally means? It means the righteous one. The name Zacchaeus means the righteous one. And somewhere along time, his parents named him. And you know, I've told you this before, that in this period of time, parents would often name their kids based on a characteristic they wanted their kid to have. Or sometimes people would change their names to a name that told a characteristic of what they were. And so at some point, Zacchaeus got the name Zacchaeus, probably by his parents, and his parents thinking, man, I want my son to be a righteous man. I want him to grow up in a deep relationship with God. And then he became a tax collector. You know, the Bible doesn't say this. I'm reading in between the lines here, and I'm sorry if that might offend some of you, but I'm guessing his parents weren't overly happy that Zacchaeus chose to be a tax collector. I'm thinking his parents were thinking, oh, Zacchaeus, we named you Zacchaeus because we wanted you to be a righteous one, someone who followed God. And every day Zacchaeus would hear his name, and he would know that it meant the righteous one. And whenever he heard of Jesus coming to town, one who was a righteous one, he just had to see Jesus. But here's a point that I think is good for us parents, that, you know, those of us who have kids that are at the age of making choices for themselves and whether they want to follow Jesus or not. Here's a message I get out of this anyway. I don't think it's an overt message, an out message, but I get it out here. Parents, never give up. Never give up. Man, if you have raised your kids to follow God, I mean, trust what the Bible says, man, that they'll come back to God at some point. That they'll come seeking God. Never give up praying for your kids. Never give up encouraging your kids. Never give up telling your story to your kids. And trusting in Jesus that someday they'll come seeking Him again. Now, I'm sure that Zacchaeus had heard many stories about Jesus. Stories of this man who had called a tax collector to be one of his disciples. Remember that? Do you remember who the tax collector was? Levi, Matthew. He was a tax collector. Jesus called him to be a disciple. I'm sure that he heard stories of Jesus going out and talking with other tax collectors and even partying with other tax collectors. We even know the story where Jesus sent Matthew out to go, no, it was Peter out to go fishing so that he could pay the taxes. So Jesus was even in favor of paying taxes. And so Zacchaeus, he just had to see Jesus. He's heard all these stories of Jesus healing people, of Jesus calling tax collectors, all these stories. And Zacchaeus just says, man, whatever I do, I have to see Jesus. Because of the stories he had heard. Now here's what this says to me as well. Folks, we need to tell our stories of what Jesus has done for us. We spend so much time trying to convince others that Jesus is real and is truth, and there's nothing wrong with that. I believe in apologetics. I've studied apologetics. I've used apologetics. I believe in that. Apologetics means to try to convince other people of Jesus. But the truth of the matter is, most people are not going to be convinced in their mind of Jesus until they are convinced in their heart of Jesus. And part of their convincing in their heart of Jesus is when they see that other people have been changed by Jesus. And the way that other people are changed by Jesus, the way they see it is when we tell our stories. When we say, this is what Jesus has done for me. This is why Jesus is important to me. And so here's one thing I want to encourage all of us to do. Let's stop trying to figure out the right words to convince somebody else about Jesus. Let's just tell our stories. This is what Jesus means to me. He might not mean that to you, and that's okay. I hope that one day He does mean that to you. But this is what He means to me. And let me just tell you my story. Let's tell our stories about Jesus. Now, another lesson that I see here, as I talked about, Zacchaeus was risky to climb that tree. He really risked a cultural stigma. by climbing that tree. But here's another lesson we learn from this. What are you willing to do to see Jesus? What are we willing to do to see Jesus? Are we willing to be pushed around by the crowds? Are we willing to be laughed at and mocked? Are we willing to climb a tree of cultural shame to see Jesus? Here's an interesting question. Would Jesus have gone and eaten a meal, spent time with Zacchaeus, if Zacchaeus had not climbed that tree? I don't know. We can't answer that because the Bible doesn't say that. But Jesus didn't come into Jericho saying, hey, by the way, where's Zacchaeus? Because I'm supposed to go eat lunch with Zacchaeus today. Jesus didn't come into town saying that. Jesus said nothing about Zacchaeus until he saw him up that tree, and he went to Zacchaeus and he said, come on down because I want to have a meal with you today. And I think what Jesus is saying is, Zacchaeus, I see what you went through to see me. I see that you did something that culturally you're not supposed to do. I see that you're willing to take a risk to see me. And so because of what you've done, I want to spend time with you today. Now, if you go to the Old Testament and the prophet Jeremiah, he speaks for God. And he says this. He says, seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all of your heart. Now, folks, here's what a lot of people do. They say, and I've had people say to me this before, well, Skip, I've never seen God, so I'm not going to believe in Him. Well, my question for them is, have you ever really searched for God? Because we don't find anything unless we search for it. And so many people want to stand back and they want Jesus to appear before them and then say, oh, okay, I'll believe in Jesus. But God says, man, you seek me. When you seek for me and you search for me with all your heart, man, I'm there. I'm waiting to be found by you. But it's your initiative. It's your choice. It's your desire. Are you seeking for Jesus with all your heart? Are you willing to climb a tree to see Jesus? Maybe a physical tree, but I'm really talking about a cultural tree of shame. Are you willing to say to your friends, man, I'm a Christian and I can't do that because I'm seeking Jesus? Are you willing to do that? That's what it takes to find Jesus. One final lesson I learned here is this. A true encounter with Jesus will change you. A true encounter with Jesus will change you. Zacchaeus was changed. He'd been a swindler, he'd been a hustler, he'd been a thief, but this encounter with Jesus changed him. And it changed wasn't just in his mind. Oh yeah, okay, I believe in Jesus. It wasn't even just in his heart. He changed his heart, which changed his actions. And he said, Lord, if I've done anything, he said, first of all, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give half of my possessions to the poor. Man, I'm just realizing, you've changed me. I'm going to give half of my possessions away. And then he said, if I've cheated anybody, I'm going to give back 4 times what I've cheated them. If you go back to the Old Testament, you'll find that the Old Testament regulation was you give 1/4, you give what you stole plus 1/4 back. Zacchaeus changed that fraction, didn't he? He took that 4 from the bottom and put it up top. And he said, I'm going to give back 4 times. This man was changed. In the book of James, we find this powerful statement. He writes this, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Dead. In other words, it's non-existent. It's not there. What he's saying is that true faith will always lead to transformation. Zacchaeus was transformed. He was changed because he found Jesus. There's one last thing that we miss in here, and it's not listed there in your notes. Many people in this country say that they're Christians, and they think they're in good shape with God simply because they say that. But I think this story has a message that we sometimes miss. Zacchaeus was a Jew by bloodline, by heritage. But it was only after Zacchaeus changed, after he showed his faith, that Jesus made this statement about him. There in verse 9, Jesus says this, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." Zacchaeus wasn't saved because he was a Jew. Zacchaeus was saved because he trusted in Jesus. And Zacchaeus wasn't even a true son of Abraham before. Jesus didn't call him a son of Abraham until after he changed. Now, Zacchaeus was a Jew. Yeah, absolutely. By bloodline, he was a Jew, but he was only a son of Abraham when he had faith. Because here's what Paul says about children of Abraham. He says, "Understand this then, that those who have faith are children of Abraham." It doesn't come by bloodline. Being a Christian doesn't come by bloodline. Being a Christian doesn't come because you grew up in America. Being a Christian doesn't come because your parents are Christians. Being a Christian doesn't come because you say, "Hey, I guess I'm a Christian because I'm nothing else." Being a Christian comes because you've placed your faith in Jesus Christ and He has changed you. Have you been changed? I hope so. Let's pray.